Frank Lucas said nothing, made no explanation. Just set the briefcase down in the front pew of the church and walked back out. $100,000 in cash. The one move nobody in Harlem had ever dared to make. Abyssinian Baptist Church, Harlem. Sunday, June 11, 1972. 11:47 a.m. 300 people in Sunday clothes. Mahogany pews polished to a shine. Light filtering through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the wooden floor. The choir had just finished. His eye is on the sparrow. Pastor Williams was stepping up to the pulpit for his sermon. Frank Lucas sat in the fourth row. Black suit. Silk tie. A black leather briefcase resting on the pew beside him. Nobody thought anything of it. Frank came to church every Sunday. Sat in the same spot. Never caused trouble. Never drew attention. That was Frank's way, be present, but invisible. Powerful, but quiet. The pastor opened his Bible. The congregation settled into that expectant silence that comes before a sermon. And then Frank Lucas stood up. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just a smooth, deliberate rise from his seat. He picked up the briefcase. And he began walking down the center aisle toward the front of the church. Every head turned. The pastor paused mid-sentence. The organ player's hands froze above the keys. Frank walked with the same calm he brought to everything. His footsteps barely made a sound on the wooden floor. But in that silent church, each step felt like a declaration. He reached the front pew. Set the briefcase down gently. Unlatched it with 2 quiet clicks. And opened it. The congregation leaned forward. The pastor stepped back from the pulpit. Inside the briefcase, stacks of $100 bills. Neat. Organized. Impossible to miss. Frank didn't count it. Didn't announce it. Didn't explain. He simply closed the briefcase, latched it again, and walked back down the aisle. Same calm pace. Same invisible power. He reached his seat in the fourth row. Sat down. Folded his hands in his lap. And waited for the sermon to continue. Frank didn't argue. He didn't explain. He waited. To understand what Frank Lucas did that Sunday morning, you need to understand what was happening in Harlem in June 1972. Frank Lucas wasn't just rich. He was quietly dismantling the entire heroin distribution system that had strangled Harlem for decades. He'd cut out the Italian middlemen. Gone directly to the source in Southeast Asia. Brought in blue magic. The purest heroin anyone had ever seen, and undercut every competitor's price while tripling the quality. He was making money nobody could count. But he was doing it the way he'd learned from Bumpy Johnson, the man who taught him everything. Stay invisible. Don't flash. Don't attract attention. Make money, keep your head down, survive. The problem was that invisibility only worked if the people who mattered knew you existed. Frank controlled territory. He had soldiers. He moved product. But in Harlem's complicated hierarchy of respect, he was still seen as Bumpy's protégé. The quiet one. The one who worked in shadows while louder men claimed the spotlight. 3 weeks earlier, a crew from Brooklyn had tried to muscle into Frank's supply chain. They'd approached one of his runners, offered more money, suggested that Frank was soft, and wouldn't do nothing about it. Frank had handled it quietly. 2 conversations. 1 warning. The Brooklyn crew disappeared. Nobody got hurt. Nobody went to prison. It was efficient. Clean. Invisible. But the problem with invisible solutions is that nobody learns the lesson. A week later, a lieutenant in Frank's own organization, a man named Marcus Reed who'd been with him for 3 years, had started skimming. Not much. Just enough to test whether Frank was paying attention. Enough to see if the quiet boss would stay quiet. Frank found out within 48 hours. His accounting was too precise for that kind of mistake to hide. He called Marcus to a meeting. A warehouse in the Bronx. Just the 2 of them. Marcus came in defensive, ready to deny, ready to make excuses. Frank didn't raise his voice. Didn't threaten. Just opened a ledger and showed Marcus the numbers. Where the discrepancy was. How much had been taken. How long it had been happening. You took from the organization, Frank said quietly. From the people who depend on this money to eat. To pay rent. To survive. Marcus tried to apologize. Tried to promise it wouldn't happen again. Frank shook his head. I'm not firing you. I'm not hurting you. But you need to understand something. When you steal from me, you're stealing from every person who works for me. Every family that depends on this operation. You made yourself more important than the community. He closed the ledger. You're going to pay it back. Every dollar. And you're going to do it publicly. At church. Sunday. In front of everybody. Marcus had stared at him. You want me to what? Stand up in front of the whole church and admit I stole from you? No, Frank said. I'm going to do something else. And when I do it, everyone will know what it means. Including you. Marcus didn't understand. But he nodded anyway, because when Frank Lucas said something in that quiet voice, you didn't argue. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still ahead. That Sunday morning, Frank had arrived at church with the briefcase. Inside, exactly $100,000 in cash. Not his money. Not money he'd stolen. Not money he was laundering. It was a tithe. 10% of what his organization had made the previous month. Money that, according to the church's own teaching, belonged to God. Money that would go to the church's food program, youth center, community outreach. But more than that, it was a public declaration. Frank Lucas was putting $100,000 in cash in the front pew of the most prominent church in Harlem, where every hustler, every dealer, every person with any connection to the street would see it. Where the message was unmistakable. I make this much money. I'm not hiding it. I'm not afraid of who knows. And I give more to this community than any of you. It wasn't about charity. It was about power. The kind of power that doesn't come from violence or threats. The kind that comes from being so secure in your position that you can be generous in public. The kind that makes other people feel small not because you hurt them, but because you make them realize how little they matter. When Frank sat back down after placing the briefcase in the front pew, the church was absolutely silent. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, Bible still open, sermon forgotten. He looked at the briefcase. Looked at Frank. Looked at the congregation. He understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't a donation. This was a coronation. Brother Lucas, the pastor said slowly, his voice carrying across the silent church, has reminded us all today what it means to put the community first. He walked down from the pulpit. Approached the briefcase. Opened it again so the entire congregation could see. Nobody gasped. Nobody whispered. They just looked. $100,000 in $100 bills. More money than most people in that church would see in their entire lives. Just sitting in a briefcase in the front pew like it was nothing. The pastor closed the briefcase. Picked it up. Carried it to the altar and set it down beside the Bible. This gift, he said, turning back to the congregation, will feed 50 families for 6 months. We'll keep our youth center open for a year. We'll pay for medical care for elders who can't afford it. He paused. And it reminds us all that true power isn't about what you keep. It's about what you give away. He looked directly at Frank. Thank you, brother. Frank nodded once. Said nothing. The sermon continued. But nobody was really listening anymore. They were all doing math in their heads. If Frank could give away $100,000 to the church, 10% of his earnings, that meant he'd made $1 million in a month. $1 million. In Harlem. In 1972. And he was so secure in that position that he could announce it publicly without fear. Off camera, Frank made a choice that wasn't meant to save his life. After the service ended, Frank didn't rush out. He stood in the church courtyard, shaking hands with elders, speaking quietly with families, being exactly what he always was, present but not flashy, powerful but not loud. Marcus Reed approached him. The lieutenant who'd been skimming, whose theft had triggered this entire display. "Frank," Marcus said quietly, "I understand now." Frank looked at him. "Understand what? Why you did this? You could have just told people you were rich. Could have bought a fancy car or a big house or thrown your money around. But you didn't. You put it where it mattered. Where everyone would see it and understand what it meant." "What does it mean?" Frank asked. Marcus chose his words carefully. "It means you're not like the others. You're not a hustler trying to get rich. You're a businessman trying to build something. And the people who work for you, we're not just employees. We're part of something bigger." Frank nodded slowly. "That's right. And when you took from the organization, you weren't just stealing from me. You were stealing from every person who depends on what we're building. From the kids who eat at that youth center. From the families who'll get food from the church. You were stealing from the community." "I know," Marcus said, his voice thick. "And I'll never do it again." "I know you won't," Frank replied. "Because now everyone knows what this organization represents. Not just money. Not just power. Something permanent. Something worth protecting." 3 days later, word spread through every corner of Harlem, every hustle, every crew. Frank Lucas had put $100,000 in the church. Not as a bribe. Not as laundering. As a tithe. The Brooklyn crew that had tried to muscle and sent a message. They were pulling back. No disrespect intended. They hadn't understood who they were dealing with. The Italian families who'd been cut out of Frank's supply chain sent their own message. They wanted to meet. To talk terms. To show respect. And within Frank's own organization, the skimming stopped. The testing stopped. Because everyone understood now. This wasn't just an operation. It was an institution. And institutions don't tolerate theft from within. But what happened next was the moment everyone would remember. 2 months later, Frank was called to a meeting with the heads of the 5 families. Not in a warehouse or a back room. In a restaurant in Little Italy. A public place. A sign of respect. Frank went alone. No bodyguards. No weapons. Just his presence. The meeting was brief. The Italians wanted to negotiate terms for purchasing Frank's heroin. They were willing to pay more than they'd been paying their previous suppliers. They acknowledged that Frank's blue magic was superior to anything else on the market. They wanted in. Frank listened. Said very little. And then he made them an offer. He would sell to them. At a fair price. With one condition, they would distribute through his network, using his people, following his rules. He wasn't interested in being their supplier. He was interested in being their partner. The Italians looked at each other. This wasn't how these negotiations usually went. Usually, the supplier took whatever terms the families offered. Because the families had power. Connections. History. But Frank had just put $100,000 in a Harlem church. In public. Without fear. That kind of move didn't come from someone looking for permission. It came from someone who already had power and was choosing how to use it. They accepted his terms. Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant as the most powerful heroin distributor on the East Coast. Not because he'd threatened anyone. Not because he'd fought for territory. Because he made a choice about who he wanted to be, and he made it publicly, in front of everyone who mattered. The briefcase in the church wasn't about charity. It was about legacy. Share and subscribe. This is how legends are remembered. The $100,000 Frank Lucas put in Abyssinian Baptist Church in June 1972 funded the church's community programs for 18 months. The youth center stayed open. The food program fed families. The medical fund paid for care. And every person who benefited from that money knew exactly where it came from. When Frank was finally arrested in 1975, the church didn't distance itself from him. Pastor Williams visited him in prison. Said that whatever Frank had done illegally, he'd also done something important. He'd shown that power without responsibility was nothing. That the people who made money off a community owed that community something in return. The briefcase itself is still talked about in Harlem. Old-timers tell the story to younger generations. Not as a story about crime. As a story about power. Frank Lucas understood something most people never learn: respect isn't taken. It's given. And it's only given to those who understand that power means nothing if you use it only for yourself. After his arrest, after his time in prison, after his entire empire collapsed, Frank was asked why he put that money in the church that day. Why he made himself visible when his entire strategy had been built on invisibility. His answer was simple. I wanted them to know who I was before they forgot. The briefcase sat on the altar for 3 weeks before Pastor Williams had it moved to the church office. He kept it there for years. Empty now, but preserved. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is give away what everyone else is trying to keep.